Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting event. So following on from Carol's presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the genre of memoir by folks who knew Gurdjieff, 3 examples in particular. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the initial context in which Gurdjieff was emerging in the interwar period. So my revised version of this presentation, I've actually added a question mark. So instead of after presence, how memoirs remember Gurdjieff's charisma, it's really going to be can memoirs remember Gurdjieff's charisma with a question mark. As indeed I've put in this revised title here. So there's 2 parts to this briefly. Part 1, the context, and then part 2, the memoir. The context is interesting and important to me as a scholar of the study of religions, because inevitably this field is comparative and contextualized, and an important part of knowing what's going on in any particular instance is knowing something about the context and the place of origination and development and what else was going on there. So in my pieces on Gurdjieff and my work on Gurdjieff, to which I've been indebted to Carol Cusack in particular, but also to Joseph Azizi, I like to situate Gurdjieff in a comparative field, and in particular, in the historical context, an interwar European guru field, and I'll explain that term in a minute. And this guru field, this field of interaction between multiple teachers and seekers, if you like, that's how the field is structured. It's structured by interactions between seekers and multiple teachers. And in this field, the authority of a teacher in particular, I think, is transmitted through their charismatic presence. So I'll unpack that in a minute more fully. That's the first part. The second part is the memoir arising later than the actual events of the field, if you like. And in the second part of this talk, I'm going to try and argue that the later absence, the loss of the teacher, generates a yearning to restore their presence. And this is where the memoir comes in. And as you all know, it's such a huge genre of works of literary production in the wider field of the Gurdjieff movement. And I'll look at 3 convenient examples, including Zuber, pictured here just now, to look at the ways that genres struggle with the idea of trying to recall the presence of Gurdjieff, and I'm taking it as axiomatic here that presence and the communication of being through presence is a key part of this work. The genre of memoir struggles with the task of trying to recapture that presence and put it on the page. And I say after presence, the title of this talk, because the memoir comes literally after the physical encounter, the physical presence of the teacher, but it's also after in the sense of aiming to recover, seeking for, stretching out for that presence to bring it back to life. But the larger question I suppose I want to raise at the end of the brief talk is that despite the best intentions, is the attempt to represent presence a formal mistake in the sense of can textual mediation really capture this most important of things? And I think the memoirs themselves are alert reflexively to this anxiety, to this danger, to this potential mistakenness, if you like, through their reflections in their texts about whether they can really do this. And again, a few simple examples will show that. So 2 parts, and let me unpack a bit further than the first part, the context. And I want to turn to the work of Andrew Rawlinson here briefly. Carol mentioned James Webb, an important figure. Andrew Rawlinson wrote this massive compendium at the end of the 1990s, which some of you may know, 500 pages or so. And he includes Gurdjieff in this compendium of what he calls a new kind of authority emerging in the modern world. And I think Carol is also right to talk about modernity as a key locus of the Gurdjieff work. And this new kind of authority he describes as Western teachers in Eastern traditions. And he describes these teachers as independent teachers, independent instructors, independent authorities who belong to no tradition but teach from themselves. And he describes 4 principles underlying this new pedagogy. This is Rawlinson's description here. First, that human beings in this new lineage, or this new tradition, if you like, are best understood in terms of consciousness and its modifications. Second, that consciousness can be transformed by spiritual practice. Third, that there are gurus, masters, teachers, those 3 terms with the slashes between them are his. There are gurus, masters, teachers who have done this. And fourthly, they can help others to do the same by some form of transmission. So these are the 4 principles. And I want to add a 5th principle to this new form of pedagogy emerging in the 20th century. And that's the principle of charismatic authority. So the 5th principle I would add to Rawlinson's list is that the new Western teacher's authority is transmitted through charisma. Now the term derives from the Greek word, which in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians means something like gift or divine favor, or perhaps less particularized, we might think of it as extraordinary power. Now I want to use the term as adapted by Max Weber to denote one of 3 types of authority which Weber thought were means of legitimating, forming, and transmitting religious traditions. Well, indeed, any kind of tradition, actually, but particularly in this wider field of religion, perhaps with inverted commas. Traditional authority is one form of legitimation and transmission where the authority is established by repetition of established practices and rituals. And these 3 types are not mutually exclusive, and in fact one could argue, I think, that there's elements of traditional authority in the transmission of Gurdjieff work, as far as I can see. The second type, rational legal authority, well, this is something for those of us who labour in the fields of the university. We're all too familiar with this. We have to wade, and digital culture has made it even worse, we have to wade through reams of instructions and algorithms and programs to download that tell us what to do and how to do it. So this is submission to legislative documents and to bureaucracy. And the third type, which I'm particularly interested in, is charismatic authority. And this is transmitted via force of personality and presence. So just to unpack a little bit further how Weber thought about charismatic authority, a certain quality of an individual personality, he says, by virtue of which this personality is set apart from ordinary people and treated as endowed with exceptional powers or qualities. And these powers are not accessible to the ordinary person, but are regarded as of divine origin or as exemplary, and on the basis of them, the individual concerned is treated as an authority, as a leader. The other thing about this, then, is it's a structural relationship, because you can't really have a charismatic authority unless this is affirmed by a student or students or by an audience. So no students, no audience, there's not really a charismatic authority there. Amanda Lucia, an American scholar of the new religious field, argues that the Anglicization and transfer of guru from the South Asian context means that we can now actually describe a transnational or an international guru field, which was the word I used at the start of this talk, a field of interaction, if you like, between those Western teachers and Eastern traditions operating according to these 4 new principles of pedagogy, but is becoming instantiated, well, internationally in our time. But an earlier iteration of this formed the interwar European field, which is arguably the major context for the development of Gurdjieff's teaching and where he first starts to evince his charisma. And many of you will be familiar perhaps with God is My Adventure, a book by the Anglo-Polish journalist Rom Landau there. It's an interesting book because whether or not you agree with Landau's rather kind of vain descriptions of his interactions, the subtitle, or the title and the subtitle, is interesting. God is My Adventure. It's a book on modern mystics, masters, and teachers. And if you don't know it, it's a very interesting journalistic account of a whole range of contemporary teachers emerging in Paris, England and Berlin in the late 20s, 1930s, including Gurdjieff. And many of you will be familiar with his rather uncomfortable interview with Gurdjieff and his kind of apparent dislike of Gurdjieff and his interesting and interpretation and analysis we might make of that encounter. So the European guru field in which charisma is an important trajectory of transmission of authority. Now the memoir, having established that context, I realise I've spent a bit too much time on that maybe, let's talk briefly about how the memoir seeks to go back, if you like, to that time and recover the charisma of the subject, in this case Gurdjieff. So the form of the memoir is anecdotal, it's episodic. I remember when, on another occasion, this happened. The tone tends to be affective and subjective, it's emotional. The relationship with the subject is key. And the rather complex aim is to represent or represent through a text an absent presence. So it's a very kind of complicated form of recovery, if you like. And the memoirs themselves are alert to this and know this. And that takes me back to my opening remarks about, is the form of the memoir, is the written textual form of the memoir in some ways a mistake, because presence can never really be represented. The aim, though, clearly is to bridge that gap between presence, original, authentic presence, and its representation. So I'm going to skip this slide because time is short and go on to the three examples of the text in question. But the point here is representing presence. The penultimate bullet point on this slide is the paradoxical aim of the genre of memoir. How is this done? How can it be done? Can it be done? So three memoirs reflect on this process, and I've taken a few choice selected quotes from them to try and make this point. The first attempt to represent the presence of Gurdjieff is from Margaret Anderson's book, The Unknowable Gurdjieff. The title itself already alerts us to worries about whether this can indeed be represented. Gurdjieff himself can indeed be represented. Page 9 of the book, she writes, I shall write of what Gurdjieff said when I was there to hear him say it. She goes on, this book is far from being a study, a portrait, a document, etc. I'd like to think of it as a sort of primer. The most I hope to accomplish is an evocation. An anecdote which kind of, again, teases that out more. One day I told Gurdjieff that I wouldn't be coming to him every day for a while. Why, he asked. Because, she says, I must finish my book, the book that became The Fiery Fountains. Gurdjieff says, book is nothing. If not come to me now, perhaps later it'll be too late to come. Then you cannot come any more than you can kiss your own elbow. So never mind about the book. Come and see me. The presence is the thing. The presence is the key. So already anxieties in this interesting text about can it work? Can it accomplish its purpose? Second example of the attempt to represent presence is John Bennett's Gurdjieff, A Very Great Enigma, published the year after Anderson. Again, this is not long after Gurdjieff's death, 12, 13 years after his death. Already on the very first page, Bennett is worried about his enterprise, one might say. Gurdjieff was a very great enigma in more ways than one. First and most obvious is the fact that no two people who knew him would agree as to who and what he was. Everyone who knew him, continues Bennett, upon reading what other people have written about him, feels that they have not got it right. Each one of us, he continues, believes we saw something that other people did not see. It went with the peculiar habit Gurdjieff had of hiding himself, of appearing to be something other than he really was. And the third example, as I come to a close, Rene Zuber, who we saw earlier on, his 1977 book, Who Are You, Monsieur Gurdjieff? Right from the offset, Zuber is worried. Who was he? Many of those who approached him were tempted to ask him, but such was his prestige, such was his power, such was his charisma, that they never dared to ask him outright. Some people were curious, others had an inner thirst and been told that here was a spring at which this thirst could be quenched. Gurdjieff seemed to be filled with an experience almost incommunicable, which set him at an unbearable distance from the common run of mortals. So the experiential factor, the sense of being, the sense of presence that's almost incommunicable, sets him apart. Here again is a sense of a charismatic authority given through presence. And finally, and perhaps most tellingly in these early anxieties that Zuber records, those of us who knew him would not go looking for him in any archives. So, conclusion, representing presence. Going back to this interwar guru field and the folks who knew Gurdjieff, were around Gurdjieff, can this presence, can this being actually be reproduced in a text? Clearly, there are many dimensions to this task and the paradoxical task of trying to do it. Margaret Anderson, as we saw, emphasizes the necessity of physical and temporal proximity. Remember, she says, when I was there to hear him say it. And later, she says, or rather, she records Gurdjieff saying, later might be too late. Don't bother with the book. Later, it's going to be too late if you don't come now. Bennett emphasizes multiple perspectives. No two people who knew him would agree as to who and what he was. Bennett also worries about textual misrepresentation. Upon reading what other people have written about him, he says, everyone feels they've not quite got it right. And Zuber, as we saw, is skeptical of text per se. Those of us who knew him will not go looking for him in any archives. So the takeaway point is, paradoxically, despite the ink spilt in this huge genre of memoirs, that Gurdjieff is unrepresentable, unknowable in Anderson's terms, a very great enigma in Bennett's terms. Who was he, asks Zuber. So, can memoirs remember Gurdjieff's charisma? Can textual mediation substitute for oral transmission? Or we might put it, in Anderson's terms, simply, since the unknowable cannot be conveyed, why study what cannot be known? Well, here's my answer from the academic study of religions. One can grant, says Robert Baird, American scholar whose 1971 book, Category Formation and the History of Religions, not a title you find at airport bookstores usually, but one which I've found to be very formative for my own work in the study of religions. Baird writes, one can grant that it is the total scholar who is at work in the historical study of religions, but the total scholar need not always ask the normative question. While they may not finally do justice to their own totality by not doing so, there are indeed other legitimate questions which are penultimate. The whole man, the whole person, the whole scholar may ask questions and offer answers on various levels. Thank you. Oh yeah, okay. I just put up the list of and there's a partial list of some of the memoirs in which Gurdjieff is either sole or part subject, and I'm sure you could add many more titles to that.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.